I still think doing the CFII is one of my favorite practical tests to do, right? So, and the reason is by the time we've gotten to this check ride, you've been through a few of them. It's almost a collegial discussion that we're having, and at this point, we're getting closer to peers, right? I mean, I get, I'm a DPE and scary across the table, but I get to ask questions, and you might get to ask questions back of me. I think it's kind of fun to get into discussions as we get a part of that testing on these CFII tests, where people aren't quite as scared of the darn examiner anymore.
That's DPE Jason Blair talking about the CFII Checkride. And even if you never plan to become a CFII, you may still learn a few things from Jason today about becoming a better instrument pilot. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. I'm the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Last week in episode 241, I read an email from a listener who had some misconceptions about the division of responsibilities between pilots and controllers. We also talked about new products and aircraft announced at AirVenture in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/241. And this is a listener-supported show, and yes, we're still ad-free. And if you enjoy listening to this show, it's possibly because you're learning something in these shows and you find value in them. So why not get even more value from them by joining the club and supporting the show financially? Think about if you were to learn just one thing from these shows that could someday save your life. And what's that worth to you and your family? So sign up now by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, which takes you to our Patreon site where you can sign up and see all the goodies you'll get for joining the club. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And thank you so very much for supporting the show. Now let me tell you a little bit about Jason Blair. Jason is an FAA DPE, or Designated Pilot Examiner, who gives check rides to pilots, and he's also an active flight instructor. He writes for both Flying and Plane and Pilot magazines. He's the past executive director of NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors, and he's served on a number of industry committees. And he's also one of our supporters who donates money each month through patreon.com to support the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now here's our conversation with Jason Blair. Jason, welcome to the show. Great to have you back here again.
Glad to be back.
Let's talk about the CFII today. And before we jump into it, let's just talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of doing a CFII as a first check ride. Now, traditionally, the vast majority of the people do the CFI airplane check ride first, and then later, if they choose to continue, they would move on and do the CFII so that they can also teach instruments. Talk a little bit about the pros and cons of doing the CFII first.
So that's a really good question, and I think it's something that has been contentious, we'll say, over the past. There's been some interpretations in the last couple of years about what you can or can't do with it. In a lot of cases, what we saw a CFII issued first for was for folks that were military competency equivalency issuances. They were an instrument pilot in the military. They had a CFI issued based on that. And it might be just an instrument-only CFI, so then they would have to add on regular CFI privileges. So that was one of the real common ways we saw that happening in the past. But there were a few schools that kind of told folks, hey, do you want to do your double I first? And it historically seemed to be a little bit limited on what you could do with it. We've had some interpretations that allow you to do instrument instruction if you're just an instrument instructor in single engine airplanes. So that's basically the gist of it. And for somebody that is, really proficient with instruments, it might be an easier way for them to kind of get into the CFI realm, especially if they've been flying, doing other things that are instrument related. Instead of coming back and trying to figure out all those VFR maneuvers, doing that double I might be something, if they're very, very instrument proficient, that's a little bit easier for them to jump in for that initial CFI certification. So some folks do that, and it's still going to have all of the areas of the ACS for that double I, and you're going to have FOI related materials. You don't get to skip that stuff for your initial, but it might be something you're more kind of proficient with at that point instead of coming back to other maneuvers. So a few people do choose to do that. It's really kind of a personal preference at that point. But from a check ride perspective, that is something we can do. Now, what I will tell you we see in a lot of cases is folks that let a CFI lapse if they didn't renew it, one way to renew a CFI is to reinstate it with adding on another instructor privilege. So, if you were an airplane single engine CFI, you never had that double I, and you let it lapse a few years, but you've been flying charter 135 airlines, you think, boy, I'm really instrument proficient, but I haven't done eights on pylons in 20 years. Maybe doing that CFII might be a great way to reinstate the CFI as well. So those are kind of the three main places where we see somebody doing a CFII check ride that's kind of outside the normal. Hey, I'm just a CFI and I want to add on those privileges to be able to train instrument students and the students who need instrument experience towards their commercial or ATP as well. And that's really the bulk of them. That's what we're looking at for most of them, but there are a few other ones out there too.
And we should point out that the FAA has flipped and flopped on their interpretations of the privileges for an initial CFII. If you go back, 20 years ago, these people were allowed to go out and teach in airplanes, and then along came an interpretation that said, no, if you've got only a CFII, you are not allowed to teach in an airplane. You can use it in a simulator, and it has flipped yet again a few years ago. So if this feels like a confusing topic, who people thought they knew what the story was on this, yeah, stay tuned. It keeps changing.
Max, it's absolutely clear and is exactly what it is until it changes again, okay?
Yeah, for sure. Now, tell us a little bit from an examiner perspective. You told me at one point that you'd never actually done one of these. Why is this difficult for an examiner to do? So if somebody walked over to an examiner, they might not be real enthusiastic about doing a double I first.
Sure, that CFII first is just a little bit less common. We're going to have to jump into a couple of different ACSs to do this, along with the PTS that drives it. So it is actually a little bit more work for the examiners who are doing this. We're going to have to talk about that CFII PTS, which is still in place for instructor check rides. We do anticipate we're going to get an ACS for these in the upcoming near future here, but they're also going to have to talk about things for that CFII related to the instrument ACS and portions of that commercial ACS because there are instrument requirements that have to be taught by a CFII for commercial pilot students too. So there's a little bit of work that goes into building that plan of action for an examiner who's going to be doing a CFII check ride as the initial CFI. And then they're certainly going to have to build in all of those FOI related materials as well that are just kind of native in the initial CFI test. So a little bit of work for the examiner part. And I would say if the examiner's got some work to do, that means the applicant also really should be looking at all of those things as well to make sure that things they're going to get questioned on, they've reviewed and prepared for.
Okay, great. So we're going to, from this point forward, just assume that anyone going for their CFII already has a CFI certificate, most likely the CFI for single engine aircraft. But as long as we're talking about this, you could get a multi-engine CFI first, couldn't you?
You absolutely could. And I've actually got one of these scheduled in 2 weeks. The gentleman owns a Cessna 310. So his initial flight instructor certificate will be in a multi engine airplane. And you can certainly do your CFII in a multi engine airplane as well. So we've certainly had some people do those too. And, if that happens to be the airplane that you are most proficient in or have available to you, it might be what you choose to do. And there's a couple of differences between that double I and certainly what you would do as a double I if you're going to be operating in a multi-engine versus a single engine airplane. The biggest of those is obviously the single engine instrument approach procedures, teaching, and conducting that you're going to have to do as a CFII in a multi-engine airplane.
Yeah, a lot of different permutations here. So now let's just talk about the traditional process. Someone has gotten their initial CFI. Now they're going to go for their double I. We talked back in episode 219 a little bit about the requirements for taking a CFI check ride. I assume those also apply to the double I. For example, you've got to be 18, hold a commercial or an ATP certificate, and a number of other requirements. Tell us about the knowledge tests, the writtens that you would need to do as a CFII.
Sure, and this is one of those add-on ratings where there are not a lot of experience requirements that are specifically spelled out. It's a proficiency-based add-on. So somebody really just needs to show up with some of these boxes checked, right? So they're already a commercial pilot with a CFI. They are going to need a knowledge test for that flight instructor, instrument, airplane, or if we're doing helicopter, whatever it happens to be, to add that on. So it's basically another instrument related knowledge test that they're going to have to take. I strongly encourage folks when you're studying for this, I know it's a little bit extra cost, but also take that instrument ground instructor knowledge test. You can be an instrument ground instructor just based on having a CFI and taking that knowledge test. And it's an administrative processing only, no check ride for that one, but you get another certificate in your pocket, or added to the AGI if you happen to have that. That lets you have that ground instructor privileges. It's a very, very similar test database as the instrument airplane. You're basically taking the same test twice, and if you pass it, you get another certificate. And the honest answer is most of the time you're not going to study for it ever again, right? So while you know this stuff, do it while you can. So you are going to have a knowledge test. You've got to get above the 70%, just like every other test. And then you're going to have to just be proficient and be ready to take that practical test with a sign off from an instructor. So there's no specific number of approaches or experience time or anything like that you have to do to take that CFII. I will kind of advise, though, a lot of people, when they do come to these, when they don't go successfully, have treated as if all they have to do is be an instrument pilot from the right seat. And that's really not what we're looking for here. We're looking for you to be able to teach from that right seat, be aware of what's going on, and still manage the approaches and things that are going on at the same time. So make sure it's not just I shot a couple approaches from the right seat, I'm off to my double I. Make sure you're ready to actually be a teacher from that right seat when you're going to go take that CFII practical test.
So I got into the teaching game first by getting my instrument ground instructor certificate. I taught at instrument ground school. I later went on to get my CFI and CFII. And I got to tell you, I think there's a huge advantage to getting a ground certificate first. Talk a little bit about your experience with that.
Sure, and I'll kind of mesh this into a couple of other pieces here. Anytime you can have some experience teaching, it's going to improve your knowledge of that material. We say teach it to know it, right? I'm going to add a note here that many times I see people do their initial CFI, and then within a week or two, they do that CFII. I can tell you absolutely, I see more successful pass rates in individuals who have taught a little bit as a CFI and then add that CFII on after doing a couple hundred hours of instruction. Even it doesn't have to be lots, but just having gotten into an airplane and taught students for a little while, it really makes that pass rate go up on the CFII practical test, because they've kind of gotten into it and figured out, why I really got to teach this stuff. My students don't just need me to do this from the right seat. And just having a little bit of experience teaching, whether it's on the ground, you're teaching some of that material, or if you are a CFI first before you do that CFII, I think it does enhance your ability to be successful when you get through that test. And Max, I'm going to say that I still think doing the CFII is one of my favorite practical tests to do. Right. So, and the reason is, by the time we've gotten to this check ride, you've been through a few of them. It's almost a collegial discussion that we're having, and people are there and they've done a little bit of this. You've been through 4 or 5 check rides, and at this point, we're getting closer to peers, right? I mean, I get I'm a DPE and scary across the table, but I get to ask questions, and you might get to ask questions back of me at the same time, and we're starting to get to the point where you're learning to teach. And I think it's kind of fun to get into discussions as we get a part of that testing on these CFII tests, where people aren't quite as scared of the darn examiner anymore.
I'm really happy you brought that up, because when I think both about my CFI and my CFII check rides, it felt exactly that way to me. I had done so many check rides at that point that I was no longer scared. And I really felt like I was there to just kind of show my stuff, let them know what I could do. The examiner kept offering, different things. So it was clearly, he wasn't just strictly evaluating me. He was also teaching me some of the finer points. And it was the most enjoyable check rides I've ever taken were those 2 particular check rides.
And Max, that means you were prepared for them. If you can go into a check ride and feel like you're having a good discussion and you're talking back and forth, that means you prepared for them. So if you're prepping for that practical test, the CFII, and you're working maybe with a stage check instructor or another fellow CFI, and you just feel like they're grilling you and it's not a discussion anymore. Maybe it's time to start looking at whether you're really ready for that test, and are you at a point where you can teach this material, because that's really what we're looking for, specifically related to the instrument material here on this CFII practical test.
And I think your point about having taught first before taking your CFII resonates with me. I remember during both of my check rides, I was standing up at the board teaching the examiner things that I had already taught. So it was great. I had stood up at the board, already taught some of these things in an instrument ground school. Boy, it really made it easy. There was nothing scary about it. I just did exactly what I'd already been doing.
And even one of the things you might do to prepare for this is just go to a local airport on a Saturday morning where there's some coffee and donuts and sit down with your approach plates on your EFB or in paper and start talking to other pilots and talk through things, right? This is a way to prepare for this and start chewing through some of the approaches, things that we're going to have to talk about on that CFII. And it gets you into that teaching mode, whether it's in a formal mode or kind of an informal mode. Take the time to kind of practice that stuff to prepare yourself for this practical test and really for any practical test where you're going to have to be teaching.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the qualification process. What kinds of things are you looking for as you're qualifying a CFII applicant? And are there things that sometimes get missed and someone isn't qualified for the check ride?
So as I mentioned kind of before, there's really not a lot for this one that we have to look for. It's basically the endorsements from the instructor, and are you ready to go with that knowledge test in IACRA? So unlike the other tests we've talked about, where you're looking for very specific cross country requirements and experience requirements, this one doesn't have any of that. And there's good and bad to that. There's less chance when we come to a CFII practical test that we're not going to have the materials required to proceed with that test as an examiner, but there's also a bigger chance that people have kind of shorted themselves in the training. And I see a lot of CFII applicants who've maybe done 4 or 5, 6 hours of we'll call it check ride prep and haven't really gone out and done, the 10, 15 hours maybe it takes to shoot some approaches, try some different ones and get a good feel for it. And a lot of times when we do the ground training, the instructors kind of assume that CFII candidate is at that CFI level. They're a pro pilot, they're an instrument pilot, and they can kind of prep themselves. And I think this is really important. If you have a CFII instructor who's training you for your CFII and they say, hey, you're good on the ground, you don't need me, right? That's the wrong answer. Take the time to go through some stuff because I am absolutely going to tell you if I show up for a CFII test while we are going to fly local approaches, it is unlikely that I am only going to ask on the ground portion only about local approaches. This is one of the coolest things about having electronic flight charts, right? I can pick a chart out by UMax. I can pick a chart in Florida. I can say, George, your new student says they want to do their CFI or do their instrument training, but while they're doing it, they want to fly down and get some barbecue in Texas, and we're going to pick approach plates all over. And what I'm looking for when we do this is, have you gotten to the point where you can not just describe the local approaches, but do you have the ability to describe how to use those approach plates and interpret them wherever you're going to be teaching a student or sending a student on their own? So the qualifications are pretty thin, but the danger there is many times people go, well, there isn't much I got to do. Let's just send them to the check ride and they'll probably be fine because they're a proficient instrument pilot. That's a very different thing than being a proficient instrument instructor.
And of course, you and Rob Mark have done a series of chart stories, if you will, for Flying Magazine, in which you take a particular instrument chart and you tear it apart. Any favorite ones from having done that stick out in your mind?
There's always a few of them around. I think my favorites have actually been a couple of in the Bahamas and in Alaska because we start seeing some unique things in these. We just wrote one up not too long ago that's going to show up in Honolulu, which was kind of interesting because they have these notes, no circling to like runway 24W. And I'm like, what in the heck is 24W? Well, those are the water runways, right? So if you really look at approach plates, there's some unique things. And I think the coolest stuff is when we pick approaches all around the country, we start seeing unique things that pop up. And there was one down in Texas we saw that was very blatant, thou shalt not circle to the southwest. And when you looked at it, it's well, because that's where the Mexican border was. And, we don't want you crossing international boundaries while you're doing your circle to land. So every approach plate kind of has got its own quirks. And the FAA works very hard to look at local airspaces and build these things in. But the gist is the structure of them and behind them is all going to be about the same kind of approach. So if we start figuring out how these approaches get built, it lets you kind of pick those approaches apart. And I'll be honest, Max, every once in a while we get a couple emails that's like, hey, you guys missed something there. And I think that sometimes is cool for those of us writing it too, because we go, oh, I never thought about it that way. And I think that's interesting to dig through these, and they're great discussion points for everybody working within the instrument system. Pick random approach plates and pick them apart with each other to help, figure out what you're looking at. And boy, if there's anything that's really important, those notes are critical. And this is something that I kind of pick at on that CFII test. And boy, I think it's Monterey out in California out there. There's a pretty good approach. There's an ILS to one side and a localizer to the other, and it's obvious the localizer is high minimums because there's these little kind of bumpy mountain things, right? And you might even choose in a scenario where you would fly the approach for the opposite direction of the winds, because the circle to land is a much lower minimum. But boy, there's some important notes that if you circle south of the runway, you're going to hit a mountain. And that's where, if we talk about a CFII, we want to see them being able to look at that approach plate, very critically evaluate it, find those notes, and help teach a student, why would you, in this case, fly right traffic to a runway instead of left? Or, do they even notice that? Well, the left traffic might take you into a mountain in the clouds, right? But the right traffic might keep you safe. So those are critical pieces on that CFII test. Can you pick those approach plates apart and help us figure out and explain to a student why some of these things might be different than just fly down the ILS and go miss straight ahead to a GPS point?
Sure. And I think differences on the missed approach can be something that people often overlook. You may wonder, well, why is DME required? It's not required for the approach. Well, guess what? It might be required for the missed approach. Or if you've got both an ILS Yankee and Zulu, why do we have different minimums for the ILS? I believe it's 8 Yankee and Zulu into Burbank, or the ILS 19 Yankee and Zulu into Jackson, Wyoming, where I was just a week ago. And the answer is, hey, if you can climb at a higher than standard rate on the mist, well, then you get to go to lower minimums. If you can't, we're going to keep you up higher so that you can fly the mist with that standard 200 feet per nautical mile grade.
I think that's a really important point here, Max. So we're talking about notes on approach plates, but what you're alluding to is that those notes refer back to either potentially aircraft capability or even systems in the airplanes. And that's pretty critical for that CFII applicant, to be able to teach us about too. So if you show up with an airplane that is WAS or non-WAS, or if it doesn't have GPS at all, helping to, understand, and for the student's sake and for the teaching purposes of the test, what the limitations are going to be based on the systems that you have is going to be a very critical part of that practical test. And I'm going to dig into it. And this is one of the main parts of that CFII test is, can you teach the systems? If we look back kind of in the olden days in the instrument flying handbook, it was, here's our 6 round instruments, and we talked primary and supporting, and that was about it. Well, things have definitely changed. I mean, in the last week, I've done a practical test in a round gauge airplane that had old school DME. I've done a test in a G1000 with WAS, and I've done a test in a G1000 without WAS that was single ADHARS. Well, each one of those, when we talk about it, has different limitations. And if you're an instructor teaching this stuff, the system's failure modes determine what you're going to do and how that's going to affect your approaches. And so if we talk about an ADHARS failure in an Avidyne, R9 system, and I go, okay, well, I got 2 of those. So if one fails, I keep doing the same thing and, just try and land. Well, if I'm in a single ADHARS airplane, I lose my ADHARS. What's my backup? In some airplanes, it might be there's an Aspen off to the left that is that G1000. It might be that I don't have anything, and I'm back to, in the case I was in a couple days ago, a round gauge vacuum attitude indicator. So, was my HSI still going to be up, or is my my track going to be up? What do I have? And these are pretty critical things for an instructor to be able to teach on that CFII practical test. So that systems knowledge is going to tie right into back to those approach plates too, right? So if we say, hey, you got to go mist, and we need a DME, is that valid if we have regular DME? Does it matter if we have a GPS? What if the GPS database is not current? Or what if it's WAS versus non-WAS, and how's that going to play into that?
Let's talk about the homework. When someone contacts you for a check ride, what do you tell a CFII candidate they need to prepare before they show up, besides writing the check, of course?
Sure, I kind of mix these up a little bit. Some of the things are, I might say, hey, you're going to inherit a student. George or Susie did a little bit of instrument training, and they want to pick you up. Maybe their instructor went off to the airline, and I like to mix it up. If you say, hey, I'm in a glass panel airplane, I might say George or Susie were previously flying in a 1971 172 with round gauges. You're going to have to figure out how to teach them to transition to glass, right? Or I might flip it if they say, hey, I'm used to flying this glass stuff, but I'm going to go, do my check ride in a, 1965 Warrior or Cherokee, right? Oh boy, they're going to have to figure out how to get them off glass and back to, and then we get them teaching, what are these darn vacuum systems and pedostatic systems? So sometimes we'll get them to try and think about how do we transition a student between these things. And a good way to do that, it was, kind of an example of somebody who maybe was an inherited student that they're going to have to bring in. And that also gives me an opportunity to say, hey, here's some of the things they've done already. And part of this test is to make sure you can qualify your student to be eligible for that practical test, right? So we're going to go through some administrative things in this, like we do in the initial CFI. We're going to do that in the double I as well. And, we assume you can do some of the basics. But if I say Susie or George has got, 15 hours of instrument training, they've done some approaches. Now, what are you going to have to do to get them to the practical test? And that's what we're looking for. Can you identify how many experience hours they're going to need? Do they have the proper cross countries they've done? And we've had some interesting recent interpretations on this that are very pertinent to the CFII practical test. And the biggest one there is that we used to need to have three different types of approach systems on that long IFR cross country. Now, the individual who does a long IFR cross country has to have three different approaches. So, for example, if I took off, and left Omaha and flew up to Wichita and shot a GPS approach, and then I went over to Kansas City and shot a GPS approach, and I came back to Omaha and shot another GPS approach. Those are all separate GPS approaches, and that would actually count in the historical context. That would not have, because they were the same types of approach systems. But as we work forward and we lose a lot of URs out in the system, and it gets harder to find some of these systems, as long as we're doing three different approaches, that counts. So I couldn't, fly to Omaha, land, turn around, come back, and fly the same GPS approach three times, in Kansas City, something like that. So we do have to mix it up. But that's something we got to pay attention to and know how to make sure you're giving your students a valid cross country that meets those requirements for that instrument rating. And another piece of that is you gotta land. So I've seen a couple cases where we've had people fly that long IFR cross country, and they shot approaches and went missed at each location and didn't land. So we still have that 61-1 requirement that says a rating or certificate qualifying cross country must include a landing at an airport more than 50 miles away. So make sure you land. And even worse, it says each airport must have an approach that you fly. So in one case, I had somebody flying out of an airport that did not have an approach active at the time. So they went to three different airports, shot approaches, came back to the home airport, and landed. And there was no approach there. So what? It says each airport must have hello and approach. So in that case, what they should have done, flown to the other three airports, landed at the last one with an approach, and then wink, wink, completed a second flight to get home to the VFR airport, right? But in their case, it was very obvious. They went missed on that last approach, did a hold, which they needed to do, and then flew back VFR. So in a very, very small technicality, that cross country didn't count, and they ended up reflying their instrument cross country requirements. So those administrative pieces of this CFII are still very important to make sure you're going to be providing a candidate instruction that's going to make them an eligible candidate for that instrument rating. And also part of this is for that commercial rating. A lot of people think this is just for the instrument rating, but we've got some flight instructor limitations out there. A straight CFI who doesn't have the instrument cannot do the instrument training toward a commercial certificate. So sometimes I'll ask somebody, "Hey, your friend George is a CFI, and his student Bill, needs that 10 hours towards his commercial, but he's going to ask you to pick it up. Well, what are you going to do in that 10 hours of instrument time toward the commercial?" Or also might say, you've got somebody that wants a restricted commercial certificate. George is going to be an ag pilot and doesn't really need that instrument stuff. He needs a restricted commercial. What are you going to do with that restricted commercial guy for the instrument training? These are parts of the privileges that ACFII will be able to conduct, and these are things we're going to ask at the administrative parts of that CFII practical test.
Wow, a lot of nuances for a CFII candidate to understand how they need to conduct the training for different scenarios for their candidates so that they're successful when their students show up for check rides. So let's imagine now that I have shown up. I'm your CFII candidate. We've gone through the qualification process. I've done my homework. Where do you start with a Q&A that you do?
So it kind of depends, and I'll be honest, I mix it up, Max. Sometimes I have given an assignment for them, and part of this is still a task area that we have to talk about is cross country planning. We might start with, well, you're going to grab a student and teach them across country, and this is a way to dive into some of those other requirements that we're going to be talking about too, to making sure that we cover things like the alternate requirements and the planning information and weather. So when we talk about some of this, we might just dive right into cross country. Sometimes I go into starting with qualifying applicants and you got a new student, let's sit down and talk about what we're going to do with them. I mix it up a little bit. So, but we do have areas that we are going to cover. Some of those required areas are going to have, navigation equipment and systems. We have to talk about the reg stuff. We've got to talk about the logbook entries. So we're going to still have, okay, you get somebody ready. What are you going to have to do? How do you qualify them for review of the knowledge test material? And usually what I do for that is actually give them some examples of knowledge tests that I've seen. Here's the 510 codes that popped out on somebody's knowledge test. What are you going to have to go back over with them? And can you show me the skill that you can do that? It's gotten pretty easy now. You go into the ACS, you grab those codes, and we have a specific area. A lot of people forget about that cross country part. This is not just about looking at approach plates, and so we're going to talk about those too. And how are we going to make go no go decision making, and more importantly, how are you going to teach a student to make that go no go? I mean, it's great if you can do it for yourself, but how are you going to get the student to understand what they need to know in terms of weather information and how they're going to build that skill to choose to go or not? So one of the things that I think is really critical, and it's actually a weak area, Max, is IPC requirements. This is a critical function of being a CFII, is being able to administrate a valid IPC. And many, many times I see people when I say, well, tell me what you're going to do IPC, they say, well, I'll do a couple approaches. Well, where do we find the guidance on this? In the back of the ACS, we have very specific guidance. You should absolutely be going to that task table at a minimum. A really well qualified applicant would probably come with a checklist of things that need to be on an IPC. And we kind of alluded to this in the beginning. If you're doing this in a multi engine airplane, many times one of the things that I see missed on IPCs is that simulated single engine approach. On the regular IPCs and single engine airplanes, a lot of times people miss the partial panel. We need to do some sort of partial panel simulation. And this is something that I bring all the way into the actual flight portion of the practical test. So I might give you the assignment of build me an IPC for the day, as if you have a student who's coming to you and says, I need my IPC in my Saratoga. It's great. Build me a plan, come to the Checkride with that, and then fly me that plan. And I might throw a wrench in it and say, ATC says the wind's going the other way and you got to switch runways. Well, can you look at your checklist and figure out what do I need to swap in or swap out to make that IPC valid? And a lot of times we miss the partial panel stuff, and a lot of times we miss the hold. So, we might go do a mist, and are there things we can or cannot substitute to make that a valid IPC? And this is a pretty critical part of being a good CFII. In many cases, our customers are doing these IPCs to meet insurance requirements. If we give them an invalid one, and then they go out and have something go wrong, indirectly, you're kind of voiding their insurance. So make sure if you're going to be a CFII, you know how to go out and give a good, valid IPC. And I am not above Max taking somebody out when I say, show me a good IPC, and we fly the whole thing, and we come back and we haven't done a hold, and we haven't done any partial panel, and we land turning to that CFI applicant and saying, wow, that was great, but why didn't we do these two things? And the reality is that means they have given an invalid IPC, and that means they do not know as a CFII what they were supposed to be doing. So, which means they're not really ready to be that CFII that day. So, cheat if you're a CFII applicant. Make checklists for these things, bring them with you, check them off along the way. Maybe ATC throws a wrench at you and says, hey, we got to switch approaches. That might mean you got to make another approach happen on that flight to really make it valid. Now, I might also say, hey, I know we got a wrench here, and you told me that we need that certain approach, but for the purposes of the check ride, we might be able to do something else. But at least you're telling me and showing me that you can give a valid IPC and you know when things are missing.
And along the lines of this example you've just given of the IPC, you've asked someone to do that on your CFII check ride. They forgot a hold or something like that. I'm imagining that means they don't pass their check ride.
It absolutely means that. And, sometimes I'll give a little bit of a hint and see if you can rally. So, I've had a couple cases where somebody has told me, hey, we'll do a partial panel GPS approach, and we'll fly the approach and they'll forget about it. And then, boy, I thought we were going to do partial panel. Oh, yeah, I forgot. Okay, well, what are we going to do now? And sometimes they'll say, well, we'll just skip it, or we'll do the partial panel on the ILS instead. Well, if we look at the ACS says the partial panel is on a non-precision approach. So, in both of those cases, you're showing me that you don't really care to do the whole thing, or you're not knowledgeable enough to make sure you're giving that valid IPC. And Max, here we are in the days of ADS-B tracking, right? A lot of this stuff's pretty trackable. If we log something that wasn't real in one of our customers' logbooks, that's going to be pretty obvious nowadays. So You just got to do what the regs say, and that's what it comes down to. It's really simple. Follow the list, make a checklist. If you're CFII, bring it with you, and use it on your check ride as well.
Well, you were talking about ILSs. Has there been a change there recently in terms of requirements for flying an ILS for the precision approach for check rides?
Sure, this is a really good point, and there's a couple of interesting technicalities here. So, for the purposes of practical tests and IPCs, we have to conduct a precision or precision like approach, right? So, the interpretations that we have gotten from the FAA are that anything that is, an ILS that has a glide slope is obviously going to count. If you happen to be that random airplane that has an MLS, I'm sure that would count, but most of us don't have that. But we do, in many cases, have LPV capable airplanes, those WAS capable GPSs. And the guidance that we've been given is any of those approaches that will take us down to 300 feet or lower above the ground, above touchdown, can count for a precision approach in terms of counting for the practical test or for IPCs. So if we've got an LPV out there that takes us down to 250 feet or something like that, we can substitute that in lieu of an ILS if we need to on a practical test or an IPC. And that gets really helpful either one, if the winds aren't going the right way for the ILSs in the area, or if there's ILSs down for maintenance, or even if you just live somewhere or you're doing your check ride that's a long ways away from an ILS, you might be able to substitute one of those approaches in. Related to that, we also have the option, and we have to fly kind of a full approach on the practical test, right? Which traditionally has included a course reversal. So you'd fly to a point, do your procedure turn, come back inbound, or it might be a hold as a course reversal. We are also allowed to, for the purposes of those, fly anything that's kind of like a T-bar approach, we'll call it. Those approaches where you have a feeder fix that's going to allow a 90-degree or more turn to the final approach fix. And sometimes this works really nicely for sequencing IPCs or those CFWI tests where we might shoot an approach and grab a T-bar. And some of them are bigger angles than that, where we don't need to do a course reversal with the procedure turn, but you are doing a large turn onto final. And in real life, this is what happens in many cases when we go out and fly in the actual NAS. I can tell you there's a lot of times when I'm flying, either charter or I guess not charter, private flying that I do with some friends and stuff when we travel across the country. I will very specifically go look for where that T bar is, and that might be the fix I file to, even if I'm thinking about where I'm going to be going into on an approach. And I'll just fly that T bar in and feed myself onto the approach and make my life easy. So that's something to think about too when we look at how we sequence these. And Max, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about autopilot usage as a part of this for that CFII test, right? There's some old school mindset on this. I'm a little bit more new school when it comes to thinking about how do we teach recovery from unusual attitude recoveries. Obviously, we want some physical flying skills, but many of the new systems have those lovely blue buttons where we can push to recover, and we can use those autopilots to help us sequence down the approach. Now, we're going to be asking on a test at least one of the approaches be hand flown, and at least one of them, if you have it, use that automation that we're going to be looking for you to use that autopilot. And in this case, teach for a CFII how a student can use that autopilot. And there's lots of different variations of it. We certainly hope you know the limitations of the one in the aircraft you've brought for the day of the test. Can it fly laterally only? Does it have a 3-axis? Can you select altitudes? Will it hold a glide slope? And then also, when should you shut it off? What if it doesn't shut off? And how do we make it go away if it's doing unhappy things? So make sure you teach that automation and understand that, because that very much is one of the systems discussions we may have as a part of that CFII practical test.
Yeah, no question. CFIs of all types need to be able to teach all the different functions of autopilots, which means in some cases they're going to have to pull out some manuals, do some research, and figure it out themselves, because it's not always obvious just by pushing the buttons. Now, I'm guessing when I show up, you're going to have me teaching. Tell me about the different kind of things I might expect to have to teach you as we're sitting in the room.
So we're certainly going to be teaching, Max. One of the big things that I'm going to make you teach in most modern airplanes, and a little bit more terrifyingly as I think about it in the older airplanes that we flew so much, is about those electrical systems and how they're going to integrate with our airplane, right? Do we have single alternator, dual alternator? Do we have batteries? Do we have backup batteries? And there's a lot of different options out here for this. And it might be that you're flying in an airplane for your double I that you didn't do your primary training in. If you did your primary training in a 172, but now your double I's in a DA40, make sure you understand how those systems are going to work and how that's going to integrate what the, I'll call it cascading failure modes are, right? So if we lose an alternator, what do we have left? Do we have a battery? Do we have two batteries? Is there a backup? How long is that first one going to last? Well, if I lose my first alternator and first battery, do I still have the ability to shoot an approach? Can I get myself home? How long is that going to take? So work through those electrical systems. We're definitely going to have you teach about those systems and specifically the instrument related ones. Pretty much all the airplanes we're still flying are going to have some sort of a pedostatic system, and it may be integrated digitally. But what happens with those types of things? That drives us in many cases into discussions about icing, right? Pedo icing. If we have an airplane that is de-icing equipment, capable, we probably need you to teach about some of that de-icing stuff. We're teaching an instrument pilot in an SR22T with full FIKI. We kind of assume that owners probably bought that and they're going to use it. So we're hoping you're going to teach them about that when it comes to their instrument flying. So as that double I, we're hoping you can do that pretty well. We're definitely going to talk about how to teach that nav log, how to teach the weather information. We kind of alluded to it, and how to teach the ability to use those approach plates and fly in the NAS. But we're also going to then have you teach about some of the emergencies, Max, right? How do you apply fuel minimums? How do you apply alternate minimums? And that may even drive us back to the systems. If you have a non-WAS capable GPS airplane, your alternate requirements in terms of what you need to file might be different than if you're in a WAS capable airplane. One of the really fun ones we've been talking about lately is the minimum operational network airports and things that are out there related to, as we close down a bunch of VORs, one of the hot buttons I've had on CFII tests is, do you know what the new VOR service volumes are? We've had some changes to many of those VORs. We're above 5,000. We have a 70-mile range, and this drives right back into that planning. We might ask, okay, so ATC has advised you that we have a GPS signal blockage going on. What are you going to tell your student about where they're going to go? And this is where that minimum operational network discussion comes in. You might look at your low and route chart, find an airport that says MON above it. That's an indication that there is some kind of an approach there that doesn't require GPS. How am I going to get there? It's probably going to be going to a VOR and then feeding me onto either an ILS or VOR approach. Is that within my ranges? Is that within my alternate requirements? And this is a great discussion that can take us down a rabbit hole for a good half hour or 45 minutes sometimes.
Wow, that's a really excellent one. Certainly, MON is going to be increasingly important for us in the future. I think we all just rely on GPS to work all the time, and yet we know that there are a number of ways that it might fail us at some point in the future.
There are, and I think this is where we tie into NOTAMs too, Max, right? I mean, those NOTAMs, I see this many times in Michigan in the summer. We've got a military encampment up north where they do some summer exercise, and they actually start blocking GPS. And I know you guys see it out there in California, especially with some of the stuff out in Arizona and New Mexico, and those effects are big, and they really do affect how you're going to plan. And I got a friend that both you and I know in Greg Brown, and he said many times when those blockages are happening, they're basically down to VFR flying in normally aspirated airplanes because they can't hit the altitudes for minimum and route altitudes in the mountainous areas. And that's something we might even talk about on the Checkride too, right? How are you going to teach a student what those minimum altitudes are and how they're going to be affecting their climb performances too, right?
Yeah, and going back to the TKS that you talked about, you said, for example, an SR22T might be FIKI equipped. In fact, even the non-turbo might be as well. There's an interesting little thing that many pilots may not be aware of, which is Cirrus doesn't allow you to use that system unless you've taken the icing awareness course, which is an online course that they offer for, I think, $50. I think a lot of people don't realize, hey, you violated the regs if you haven't taken that online course.
Yeah, you're technically operating outside the manufacturer's POH recommendations. And Max, how often do they have to do this? Is this a one time?
I think it's recurrent every 24 months.
It is recurrent every 24 months, last I knew. So, if it lapses, you're still going to have to go back and do it. And that's an important piece, right? So make sure if there are specific requirements for the airplane, you're meeting those as well. And if that's the airplane you brought to the check ride, this is a pretty valid question we might ask you.
So, how many topics am I required to teach you on when we're sitting in the room there? And what are some of the other topics you might reasonably ask me to stand up there on the blackboard and teach you?
So there's not, there's a pretty small number of actual required, and actually, what we've gone through here is probably even a larger sampling than is required for the PTS. We do have to cover technical subject areas. We're going to have to cover the navigation equipment. We're going to have to cover the publications related to IFR operations. You're going to get questions on chart supplements and low altitude and route, high altitude and route, instrument approach plates, things like that. We have to cover logbook entries, preparation of a student, and that cross country stuff. But I think what you're seeing here is the breadth of material that goes into those is pretty deep. So it can take us down a lot of different paths to sample from those sections when we're testing a CFII. And it means you do have to be pretty well rounded as a CFII candidate in that instrument training process.
All right, so it sounds like we're done with all of the oral work, the stuff we're going to do in the room. We're headed out now to go fly the airplane. Are you going to tell me ahead of time what you're going to have me do in the airplane?
So that's a good question. Sometimes I give the applicants what we're going to do. Sometimes we work together, and sometimes I let them choose. So when we look at the list of things that we have to do on a CFII practical test, we must do a precision, we must do a non-precision approach. We can select between either a missed or a circling approach. We obviously are going to land from one of the approaches. We have to select at least one of either loss of comms or loss of primary flight instruments. So those are the things we have to do. One of the assignments I mentioned might be that I say, fly me an IPC. And if that's the case, we're adding a little bit more to that. In some cases, we find that either the weather's not conducive to allowing that to happen, or maybe the ATC requirements for the day, or that we're going to have to substitute a couple of things, and maybe we don't need to fly the full IPC because, for example, if we fly an IPC, we're going to have to do a missed and a hold. Well, I don't have to do that for the CFII to get it done. And one of the questions I might ask somebody is, do you want today to count as an IPC for you when they're flying it? Because if we've completed all the requirements, it does reset their IPC requirements as a practical test too. If we haven't done all of those requirements, and in many cases people say, look, I don't care, I've been flying enough approaches getting prepared for this. I've got my sixth in the last few months, which, we haven't talked about it yet, Max, but qualifying, to keep current and keep the airplane current is pretty valid questioning on this CFII practical test too, right? Can you show me how to make sure the VOR's checks are done? Can you make sure the GPS is current? And teach how to keep a student current. So we might say on the practical test, look, we don't need the IPC side, so we're going to do some of this. And I'll ask them, if you are an instructor today, and these are the 3 or 4 or 5 things that we need to accomplish for a lesson or an IPC, what would you build? And let them build it, because really after that day, it's up to them to be that CFII that's going to build a plan of action for that flight. And, so I'll say, hey, look, I need an ILS, I need a GPS, and you get to pick one other. Tell me which approaches we're going to do. Tell me how you are going to, and then show me in the airplane how you're going to simulate partial panel. Show me what's going to happen if we have that loss of a PFD. Maybe it's vacuum system, depending on what kind of airplane we're in, how we're going to simulate this, how you're going to teach it and do it, and let them go ahead and build that process. So that's a skill that we're looking for them to do on that CFII, and I really like them to kind of come up with the plan. And sometimes I'll help modify, and if we pick to approach 50 miles away and we don't need to, I might say, well, could we substitute this instead? And I might even play stupid student and go, what if I like this one instead? So that's kind of how I approach the getting to the flight portion of it and what we're going to do. So before we leave the ground, a good CFII candidate, much like a good CFII before they go fly with their own student, should know what we're going to be doing on that flight portion and be able to plan ahead for it.
When we talked on the CFI Checkride, you said that sometimes you play stupid student and you try to land and you're not very good, and you're looking obviously for the the CFI candidate to correct your mistakes. On the flight portion of the CFII, who's doing the flying? Are you doing some of the flying, or is the instructor doing the flying?
So much like the initial CFI, there's going to be a little bit of a mix of that. I usually fly one of the approaches and let them fly 2 of them. So they get to demonstrate and teach through 2. Usually I will fly the middle of the approaches to give them a little bit of a break between it. And by a break, I mean they really have to become the CFI and make sure I'm doing a good job. This is also a great opportunity for them as the CFI to while I'm flying an approach, show how they're going to simulate that partial panel. If it's a glass panel, are we going to show a panel failure? Are we going to pull circuit breakers? What does the airplane manufacturer recommend we do for that? Do we have an overlay that we're going to use? Have we got sticky notes that we're going to put on an old attitude indicator or heading indicators? That's a good opportunity for you to teach me about compass turns, right? All of these things that we can tie into that where I get to play the student. Sometimes, Max, sometimes I'm a highly proficient IPC candidate who's really kind of pushing that CFI too. If they're telling me, hey, we should slow down to 90, and I'm like, man, I want to get this approach done. Let's do it at 110. This is how I always fly. Well, are they going to step in and say, look, let's get you back to how you should be doing this too, right? So we can kind of play either stupid student or really proficient pilot with bad habits sometimes too. And are they going to be that instructors that's going to take charge? One, make sure the student's not going to veer off the approach path and do something strange. A lot of times we get to play the bad button pusher too, right? And sometimes it's let's be honest, sometimes it's me bad button pushing on purpose. Sometimes I just hit the wrong darn buttons and we have to fix it, right? And this is part of that too. We're learning as we go through this as a CFI how to make sure our students don't do things. So what I'm really looking for when I'm flying is teach me through this. And I might say, look, what buttons should I push? Talk me through what I should do. And so it gets them in that mindset of being that CFI as we do this. So I'm going to fly some of this. Their job's to make sure I'm doing that correctly, maybe helping me learn, helping me correct it. And then some of it they're going to demonstrate and show me how, if they were a new student, they would get us down too. And I think it's really important. I wrote a blog on this not too long ago. I had a CFII Checkride. It was a really unique scenario where your job as the CFI is to teach it, but also stay on top of what's happening. And the scenario was kind of unique that we were flying an ILS approach, and ATC gave us a turn right. I think it was 330 to join the ILS. And I'll be darned, the ILS course really looked like it was not to the right. And so I even did a double take for a moment, kind of went, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why is our course far left when they're telling us to turn right? And it took me a couple moments to kind of look up and go, oh, I got it. But the CFI applicant, didn't catch what I caught, and that was that the identification for that ILS was not matching what the identification on the chart was. Well, it was a unique scenario where, in that case, the tower had forgot to switch the localizer from 9 right to 27 left. So we were reverse sensing, and we weren't supposed to be, and that really kind of caused the CFII applicant to go down a bad rabbit hole, and it didn't turn out great in that case, but it was a great learning experience of, you may think everything's going good, but it might be something outside your course of control that you really got to pick that up. And that's tough to do while you're being a CFII and flying an approach and you're under the hood and you're trying to make sure the student didn't do something weird. If something's not quite right, you got to be able to make that good decision making process too, go missed, figure it out, and not continue in something that's going to get worse. So, that risk management as you're doing this. And many times when I'm having them teach me while I'm flying, I will actually stay out from under the hood because we need somebody to be the safety pilot, right? But I'll leave them under the hood while they're not flying and teaching, because it simulates what they might be doing in actual IFR conditions if they go up with a student and they're teaching in that. And that really adds that workload to them. So, be ready for that if you're working on your CFII test.
I think you raise a good point with your example about the switch being incorrect in the tower. We have a similar setup in Monterey, California, where they've got the ILS 10 right and the localizer 28 left, which use the same frequency, 2 different transmitters on different ends of the runway. So it's required for the tower to throw the switch. And
absolutely,
there have been multiple times when I've been down there and I've noticed the reverse sensing, and I've told NorCal Approach, hey, can you tell the tower to throw the switch? And they're like, oh, okay, thank you very much. So sometimes pilots need to help remind controllers to do their job correctly, because after all, we all make mistakes. But I think this highlights a real weakness that I see among instrument candidates and probably CFII candidates as well, and that's properly identifying the station. I think in the glass aircraft that I teach in, people have really gotten complacent. They look, and if they see an identifier there, they just assume, well, that must be the right identifier. They are missing the step that says, when you read that identifier, look at your chart and match it. And if they don't match, there's a problem. And I would say people routinely miss that little gotcha.
I agree. And this comes down to fundamentals, right? And this is part of being a CFII is, we have that tune, twist, talk, right? Tune is tune it in, twist it, get your twist in, talk is ID it, and look, and make sure it really is what in the old school we used to listen, right? Well, now we get spoiled and we have it digitally pop up for us. But just because we're getting a signal doesn't mean it's the correct signal. So, and that's where the fundamentals of being a CFII really come in. We're teaching these tune, twist, talk, time, turn, twist, identify, all this kind of stuff, right? There's a reason we're doing that, and it's building that base skill that keeps people safe. And when it really comes down to it, as scary as this is, math is what makes us fly around the instrument system, right? It's just math, Max, right? If we follow the numbers right and the math works out right, we end up at a runway. And it's pretty darn cool that we can take off, follow some needles around, follow some radio signals through the clouds, not looking outside, and math brings us 200 feet. But boy, if we don't follow that prescribed system, it doesn't take us to within 200 feet and we hit things. And that's really important that we follow that system. And when we're teaching as a double I, those fundamentals are what are going to be what keeps your future students safe. It means you have to have them as a double I and be able to show them on the CFII test and teach your way through them.
No question. It's important for instructors and pilots to understand the system as it is, not the way we wish it might be. And of course, the system does change slowly over time. We talked about one of those changes just now in terms of the RNAV being available as a alternative to an ILS on the Checkride for the precision approach requirement. Talk a little bit about errors that you're seeing on CFII check rides in flight. What are the common ways that people can blow this check ride?
Sure, and I think just like any instrument-related practical test, the big ones are busting minimums, going full scale deflection, not doing anything about it, and I'll call it button pushing to be a little bit broad. One of the things that we've many times run into challenges with is flying a non-sequenced hold. I'll call it. So we get used to saying, "Oh, fly," the hold that is sequenced to through the missed approach. Well, what if ATC instead says go to a different fix and fly a published hold there? Can you program a hold? In many airports, we have alternate missed approach procedures. So if I fly the ILS to runway 10 and it sequences out to intersection XYZ, there might be an alternate, ABC intersection. Well, that's not going to automatically sequence for me. I'm going to have to go in, transition to that intersection, do an OBS hold on it, and figure that out if I'm in a GPS system. Even worse if I've got one of those crazy old airplanes with two VORs and we have to follow a place out there and do cross radios, right? Those still happen once in a while. So make sure you know how to do those holds and be able to teach them how to sequence out. Those are probably the biggest things that we run into challenges with. The other one that we can run into is, and we'll wrap it into the button pushing as well, is what if you get sequenced to a different fix along the approach? Can you make yourself transition? Maybe it's not the first initial approach fix. Maybe there's an intermediate fix that ATC gives you a clearance, and it's 5 miles from the final approach fix instead of 10. Can you get the system to go ahead and transition to that? Are you making sure it's going to then sequence beyond it? I actually shot an approach the other day that I missed the activate vector to final button. Good news is it was VFR. We were just kind of practicing, and by that point we had passed the final approach fix. And I noticed here we are in the Cessna 340 we were flying, and it's counting up from the final approach fix, not down. I'm thinking, oh God, I hit the wrong button here, right? So a quick little re-button push in real life, and we're back to normal. But that on a check ride, if that's something you miss and don't notice, it's going to lead us to on a rabbit hole that's pretty tough. So make sure you know how that system is going to be working. Those are probably the most common things we see on those CFII and instrument practical tests that really end up gotchas. And as you're working through that CFII, you're adding that task saturation, the work level of either the bad student next to you, otherwise known as your examiner, or just trying to teach your way along and talk through this. That gets a little bit harder because you are taking diversion of your attention between flying and teaching, and you got to stay way ahead of the airplane in this stuff.
And let me just mention another gotcha about vectors to final. This is a common error that I see all the time. Vectors to final will display a distance not to the waypoint in front of you along the approach, but to the final approach fix. And I've seen numerous times when there's still another fix between us and the FAF, and people go, oh, it's 3 miles to this next fix. No, that's 3 miles to the
Right.
FAF, not to the next fix. Now, normally it's more miles than that. And what's happened is they think that they can descend early, for example, or things like that. So it's really critical to understand that for whatever reason, the system has been designed for vectors to final to read the distance to the FAF, not to the other fixes that may still be between you and the FAF.
Absolutely.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, any other thoughts about how we can program ourselves for success on the CFII check ride?
I think broadly for that CFII, treat this as, kind of a collegial check ride. Make sure you are actually preparing for it. It's not just a checkbox. It is still another check ride. And, as we've talked about here, there's a lot of things that can come into that. So make sure you're well-rounded, on that instrument information before you come into that CFII. If you're doing a quick CFI and double I transition between them and you feel like a couple hours and maybe a couple approaches is enough, might be a good time to step back if you got that CFII coming up and think maybe I'll just take a little time, make sure I get really good and proficient with this. Make sure you know the airplane, know those systems, and know what we're going to have to do on this to really be a good, successful CFII practical test applicant. And if you do that, we're both going to have a little more fun, I think.
Well, and my CFII check ride was probably my favorite check ride of all the roughly 9 or so check rides that I've done. So I hope everyone else enjoys it as well. Hey, Jason, thanks so much for joining us here today and helping people prep for that check ride.
My absolute pleasure. Look forward to talking to more in the future, maybe even a multi one coming up.
Sounds great. And my thanks to Jason Blair for making the time to give us a mock check ride. You can find out more about Jason and his books at jasonblair.net. And if you live near Michigan, you may want to schedule a check ride with him. In our show notes, you'll find links to Jason's website, his page for scheduling a check ride, and his YouTube channel. Now, aviation is a really small community, so see if you know any of these 2 new mega supporters who've signed up in the last week. The first is Phil Parnham Jr. He's from Georgia, and he's planning to come to California to do some instrument training with me in the fall. And he writes, I feel like I'm a late bloomer with my newfound passion in aviation, and I'm thankful for the mentorship that you provide through your podcast. Phil, thanks so much for signing up. And just yesterday, business partners Brian Pullman and Jeff Casson signed up. They fly out of Morristown and Somerset airports in New Jersey, and they're partners in Business Compliance Services, which specializes in fingerprinting services for the gaming, sports betting, and financial industries. We had 3 other people sign up for Patreon this week, including Jake Hughes at the $35 a month level, so he gets access to my online courses. Alan Markham, longtime supporter, added his pledge up to $30 a month. And Emily Ehrenfeld at the $8 a month level. Now let me tell you about all of our mega supporters. I just talked with Kevin Henderson on the phone the other night. He had a lot of helpful suggestions. Roy Williams, he's a VisionJet owner in Southern California. Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of ForeFlight, which I think you all know. Dylan Caldwell, he's a senior AME with offices in Naples and Pompano Beach, Florida. And for teenagers under 17, you don't have to pay for a flight physical if you see him. So if you need a basic med, first, second, or third class flight physical, contact him at aviatorsclinic.com. In his spare time, he tows gliders on a Piper Pawnee. Dave Brochet, he's retired from the Navy, has a commercial, and flies a Cirrus in the Jacksonville area. Kent Mazia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Air Park in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. Jonathan Weisswasser, longtime supporter. He's a CFI. He's built an RV-8, and now he flies his Meridian. Victor Vogel, we had on the show just 2 weeks ago in episode 240, talking about illusions. He lives in central PA and flies a Cirrus. Matt Souza, he's a private pilot flying a 172 out of Chicago Executive. Tim Delaney, he's a wealth manager in Eagle, Idaho, and he flies a Turbo SR20 out of the Nampa Airport. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's the CEO of Digital.ai, which is focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Mike Williams, he's the president of TCB Composites, maker of composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft, and he flies a 172. Seth Lake, he's a DPE. We've had him on the show a number of times. He specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in his 4 or 5 beach travel airs. So if you're interested in getting your multi-engine rating and can travel to Arkansas, check his school out at vsl.aero. He's also a DPE. Rick Miller, I just heard from him, and guess what? He's now teaching full-time as a CFI. He got rid of that day job. He's in the Cincinnati area, flying out of the Lunken Flight Training Center and with private owners of Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. Justin Winter, he brokers real estate on Lake Kiwi, South Carolina, and flies a 2019 SR20. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They have a pair of Cessna T240s and a nice Piper M350. Johnny McDade, he's a singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, he's a CFI at the Republic Airport on Long Island in New York. He's also teaching as a ground instructor at Pilot Proficiency International. So if you want any help from a ground instructor, reach out to him through his Facebook page at Ground Point 9, and he can help you in person, online, or through Zoom. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI, known him a long time. He teaches at Advantage Aviation at Palo Alto Airport, and he specializes in tailwheel instruction. Joseph Sheehan flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a few hundred hours in his new Vision jet. Josiah Freeman flies a Piper Arrow out of Deer Valley, Arizona. William Birch, he donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR Finish-Up and IFR Refresher courses at iflyifr.com. Stephen Bush, he's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. He mentions that they do a lot of add-on ratings from fixed wing to helicopter, as well as everything else related to helicopters at lonestarheli.com. Don Dillman, he's a professional pilot. He runs an airline flight department. He's also a CFI, flies a Bonanza, and now he's also a Cirrus CSIP instructor. Rick Mattis flies a Cessna 210 out of Fort Worth Meacham Airport. John Tosto is an attorney from Flint, Michigan, a member of the Greater Flint Pilots Association and co-owner of a Cherokee 6. Vic Bajaj, who I fly with occasionally. Vic, we need to get together again. It's been a while. Mark Holzbach lives in southwestern PA and is a longtime aviation enthusiast who wants to get his private when he retires. He runs bodensteel.com, which manufactures industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford, he's a CFI with Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He owns a VTEL Bonanza and runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. James Kerr owns an SR20. His company makes security screens for protecting your home, and you can find out more at bosssecurity-screens.com. Ed Kelly flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and his son Bennett is his best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch. Michael Ron runs a small wealth management firm in The Woodlands, Texas. You can find them at thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Todd Kussel lives in Arizona and flies an SR22 TG5. Chris Carnahan, president of Boone Valley Forest Products. He flies a VTEL Bonanza out of Spirit Airport in St. Louis. Marlon Dutra, he works in tech in the San Francisco Bay Area and flies an SR20. Richard Clark plans to start instrument training, and he's about 18 months into the build of a Vans RV14A. Sean Couch. Greg Campbell, he's a high-tech entrepreneur from Ottawa, Canada, flying a DA40NG and working on his instrument rating. John Sendak, he's a hospital executive in the New York metro area. He flies a SR22 G6 at the Republic Airport on Long Island, currently working on his commercial. Troy Bainbridge, he's a CFI who teaches out of the Weed and Redding airports in Northern California. He came down a few months ago to fly with me. He also specializes in paragliders and has an advanced P4 rating and T3 tandem instructor rating. Bob Bracall passed his private and instrument rating this past year and is about to start his commercial. Victor Cabrales recently passed his private and flies a 1975 172M out of Kissimmee, Florida. Rob Thomas lives near Atlanta, flies a Cessna 182 with a Texas Skyways conversion. Ed Perry lives in Austin, Texas, and flies a 182 out of the Georgetown Airport. Eric Stovall lives in Fishers, Indiana, and flies a Cirrus. Jim Winter flies a SR20 G3. Lambo Jayabunan, he's CTO and co-founder of an edtech startup called Knowledge Hook, focused on math education from kindergarten through high school. Daniel Maddox flies a G36 out of KMKC and 18AZ. Jim Gray from iRecover Treatment Centers in Canada. John Trowbridge, he's a doc in Humble, Texas, and he flies 4 air coupes. Scott Abuken, part owner of an SR22, flies out of Oakland County International in Michigan. Dan Morris, he's currently a cardiovascular ICU nurse using his GI benefits to obtain pilot ratings through Liberty University. Rob Chowdy, checking out an SR20, and he's working on his IFR rating. Wesley Shutt. Rick Crockett flies a Cessna 172 XP with a 210 conversion and 29-inch Bush tires. He also flies Cirrus aircraft out of Henderson, Nevada and St. George, Utah, and he's buying a Bonanza F-33A. Jacques DeMoss, working on his private at the Springfield, Missouri Downtown Airport in 152s and 172s. Arjan Gururaj, he flies a 2021 Cirrus SR20T out of North Las Vegas and has a goal to land at every Bravo airport in the U.S. Dan Sweeney, he's a student pilot working on his private in an SR20 at Mike Goulian Aviation in Bedford, Mass. Sean Murray, private pilot in South Africa, mostly flies a B-55 Baron and an R-44 helicopter. Phil, who lives on the West Coast, has his private and plans to start his instrument rating soon. And finally, Phil Parnham Jr., who we just talked about a few minutes ago. Thanks to all of you so much for your support. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.